The way I've designed this is most of it's going to be a video of me actually painting and doing the technique. And I hope that if you have supplies that you'll be following along and kind of seeing for yourself what this looks like as you start doing this technique. Additionally, there's a handout, and that will have the words behind what we're doing, and it also has some source material that I think you will find helpful. So I've listed, like, where did this technique come from? How do we know that this is actually what was done? Why does this work from, like, the way we perceive light sort of way? And it shows some examples of what I've done with it in a calligraphy and illumination perspective. But the main thing I want to say is what we're talking about is a late period painting technique. So there's certainly examples that we can look at earlier on where different amounts of watercolor was laid down to get different effects. But where you start seeing like a thick opaque pigment layer and then lighter glazes on top is really starting at around the mid 1400s. And it was like the big Flemish secret. So we see this in the Netherlands. And then what happened was it came to Italy. And this is where all of the Renaissance masters like really went, oh my God, we're playing with light and depth and everything. And it was at its peak really for like the old Dutch masters. So your Rembrandt look. And so when you look at these old paintings and they've got so much like depth and light and whatnot going on, turns out that they were using a painting trick that we're going to be sort of playing with today. So look at the handout, you'll see some of those examples from, you know, Titian, Da Vinci, like all of these masters were using a technique like this to build their lights and darks, to build their color hues, their warps, their cools, and then it actually worked pretty well when you play around with gouache. So I hope you're following along doing some painting. I hope you get the handout to sort of see some of these things that I'm pointing you to, look at the resources where you can find documentation, where you can find some pictures. We're going to be playing around with black, white, and gray. We're going to be playing around with like a warm yellow-brown with like bright yellow and a warm brown as well.
Like a yellow ochre?
Yeah, like a yellow ochre. And if you have like a green that's semi-transparent and, you know, you kind of hate to work with, that's actually going to be what you want for these circumstances.
Okay.
And then you're going to want like a flesh yellow, like a peachy flesh color.
All I have is the flesh that the kit came with.
Give it a whirl. So when you're doing the underpaint layer, you want it to be kind of what we think of as our typical illuminating thickness. So that's going to be like your melted ice cream. But when you go to do the overpainting portion, you want to thin it down a bit so that it's kind of see-through when you lay it down.
Okay, we're going to try.
And yep. So basically, it's like whatever colors you have is fantastic because this is about the process of experimenting what happens with these different colors that you use for yourself when you lay down different types of underpainting. So, and in the video, I use, you know, 4 copies of the same leaf to show the differences between like a black, white, gray, a yellow tone, a blue tone. And so whatever tones you tend to work with for those is great for this. And then we'll do some faces as well, because I think faces really, this is the strength for this technique is making people look like people.
In this first video, we're going to talk through the process of the underpainting. And in the second video, we'll look at laying the painting over it, the overpainting part of this. So right now, what we want to do is create a nice, even layer using the mid-tone of whatever color palette. So the first leaf, we're going to go ahead and leave blank as sort of a negative control of what it looks like when we don't utilize an underpigment layer. The second one is going to be a gray. So this is a monochromatic style, and it's called grisaille. So we're trying to use a nice, even application. We want to make sure that it's fairly heavy and that we're creating a very opaque layer, but we want to make sure that we're not incorporating too many brush strokes. We're also making sure that we're not sort of really blending in the paint as we go. And it's not obvious in our first application, but you'll see as we lay painting over, we're just really trying to lay this down. We're just interested in color tonality. We're not super obsessed with painting in the lines or creating a super even base. So we're just trying to get blocks of color onto our page. So our next color is going to use a nice ochre yellow to create the effect. So this is going to really add a lot of warmth to this particular painting, which you'll be able to see later after you've added the glaze. So our yellow technique is referred to as verdaccio. And so once again, we're just really interested in getting a relatively heavy layer of yellow in, but we're not obsessing too much about our applications or any of that. So as we're moving on from shape to shape, we're giving our previous layers a chance to dry. This is another really important feature of this technique. We don't want to do too much blending. We want to leave things pretty bold.
So I'm not sure if it was clear from the audio, but I just mentioned a really key point, and that's you have to let this dry between layers. You absolutely don't want to blend between your different colors.
So as a contrast to our yellow underpainting, we're going to look at a blue as well and see what that does for the color tone of our final piece. So again, we're just laying down our base color, keeping it fairly opaque.
To answer the question, yes, we are painting on Perg.
Okay, now that we've gone in and laid down our mid-tone for all of our shapes, we're going to come back in with our dark color. So for our grays, we're going to be using black. This is a nice monochromatic underpainting. We're laying it here in all of the places where we would expect to see shadows cast. So we're thinking about a sort of overhead lighting. We're providing our low lights to the underside of our leaves and underneath the veins, into the recesses between our flowers where they overlap, for our leaves where they overlap. So just keeping it a really nice, simple, blocky low light, not worried about blending here at all. Coming back in on our yellow, we're using a nice warm brown as our low light. And again, we're thinking about the areas that are going to be cast into shadow, dropping in our low light or between our leaves, creating a nice high contrast mid-tone versus dark tone. And that's going to be the real key to this technique, is creating high contrast, high pigment blocks of light and dark. Coming in our blue, we're using a nice dark blue. So again, staying within the same color family to create our contrast. Underside of our vines. Leaves cast in shadow. Area between the leaves. And again, this is a speed painting technique. We are not interested in a highly refined final product right now. just trying it out. All right, so we've given some time for things to dry between our layers, and so we can come back in with our highlights. And most of the time your highlights are going to be a really nice bright white, as we're using here with the Griselle. You can also use yellows or oranges. It depends on what it is that you're looking for. But it's really hard to go wrong with a strong application of white in this technique. Since I've got white on my brush, I'm skipping ahead to the blue because I'm going to go back and use yellow on our yellow palettes. And here I'm really paying attention to the edges, using the white to clearly define the edges of the leaves and really bring that out. So this will give you a chance to see what it looks like with a bright yellow as my highlight color. But if I were to come back, in hindsight, I probably would also hit the very edges with white to create a final, very bright effect.
Okay, so now we're starting on the faces, and for each face, I'm going to use a different color family. So the first face, I'm going to use ruddy browns. So I'm starting with my mid-tone, which is a reddish brown, and then I'll come back with a warm brown for the lowlights, and I will use both orange and white for my highlights. The biggest thing that to keep in mind is I don't want to be blending, so I'm letting it dry a tiny bit before I come back in with each of my colors. And I'm not really going to blend the highlights and the lowlights before I proceed. And what taught me how to pick out the lowlights and the highlights was actually watching makeup videos. So if you've ever watched a video on contouring, you see where they're putting very bright applications of highlight and the very strong low light under the cheekbones. And then when you go over it with your other colors, it all blends together and gives a lot of depth. And that's what we're doing here is we're basically doing dramatic contouring videos, but on the page. So I'm making sure to pick out, around the eyes, by the nose, depending on the age of the person or their expression. I might pick out certain face lines, particularly around the mouth. So that's all things that you would want to lay down here. If the person has wrinkles, go for it. And I've forgotten to do the neck in this first example, but you would carry the mid-tone down and follow the bottom of the jaw with your low light as well. And with the highlight, you can really see that I'm picking out the forehead around, over the brows and the cheekbones, plus the chin. And right now, this seems really scary. Like, this is not a good looking face. But you really need to have that strong contrast before you come back in with your glaze layers. All right, for this face, I'm going to do the monochromatic effect so that you can kind of see the difference here. So I'm starting with a sort of, slightly bright mid-tone gray. And then my lowlights are going to be with black and my highlights are going to be with white. And it seems really dramatic on the page, but when you go over it, you'll see what's going on here. The one thing I would say that becomes kind of apparent with this video is I use too much black. So if you are working with a very heavily pigmented color, you need to be careful that you're not picking it up with the glaze as you go along. All right, so I let it dry a little bit. There you go. So picking out the sides of the nose, this individual has a very prominent nose structure. And so I'm using my low lights to pick that out. So another thing I want to point out, which I'm not sure if it's clear yet, is I'm tending to minimize my brush strokes by just sort of running the brush over the page gently and not dragging the paint a lot. So I'm trying to move in the same direction and generally not disturb the paint. And that's less important on your lower pigmented layers and will become much more important later. All right, so we got all the low lights picked out. Going back in with the highlights, I'm using a bright white for this individual. And again, in retrospect, I probably should have highlighted a little bit more. Yeah, feel free to be brighter with your highlights when you lay them down. So this individual is, I'm using the green underpainting. And this may seem kind of weird, but this is actually pretty typical for olive complexions, and also it's the base for your Caucasian complexions. You just come back in and add more pink on top after you've done your glazing. So I'm using kind of a warm olive brown as my mid-tone, and then I'll be coming back in with a green. Same as with the second face, I lay down just a little bit too much of my darkest pigment. And so you'll see when I do the glazing later, I have to do a lot of layers. I end up doing something like 12 glazing layers on this face. And that's because the dark green in particular is so strong. So you might choose for your faces to start with a little bit more yellow mixed in. Save yourself some time. So yeah, picking out under the cheekbones, because this individual is at a 3/4 profile, I've got more of the low lighting going on in that portion of the face that's sort of turned away. Again, it's a great way of creating some depth. And so I'm going back in with a strong yellow for my highlights. Again, probably should have laid down a little bit of white as well, brighten up some areas. All right, and for this individual, I'm using brown as my mid-tone, and I got a little ahead of myself or forgot a piece of the video, one or the other. And this individual's from Bombay, and so she's got a lot of purple hue pigmentation in her low lights, and so I'm using that here as yet a different example of of facial coloration. Once again, though, because it's so strongly pigmented, I have to go over it more times to get it to where the purple is just kind of showing through it as a shadow rather than sort of dominating the color. And for my highlight, I'm going to use yellow to pick it out. So. All right, and so for an example of how you can use this technique to create texture, I am painting a bird. So this is a raven. My midtone is going to be just a nice steel gray, and then I'm going to pick out the depth, the edges of the feathers, that sort of thing with my black. And then do some of my bright highlighting with the white. And instead of doing a glaze for this animal, I'll come back and I'll do a textured application of the overpaint, so speckling. This is also great for animals with fur. You basically just lay down your underpaint, and then you can come back in with very, very small brush strokes and use that to create the illusion of fur, feathers, scales, kind of scales, yeah. So it gives you the depth of the coloration that you can then build the texture on top of. And in the handout, there's a link to an example where this is done using a black painting, and then the green is a fabric, a textured fabric from Period. So that's basically all there is to underpainting. You're just adding your highlight, your low light, and your midtone, whatever color palette you're using. Now I'm coming back in with my green. So for the first example, you can see what the green looks like if you don't do anything with it. And, it's a lot of people have heard the trick that you paint yellow underneath your green. Well, this is taking it to the umpteenth degree. So, when you don't underpaint your green, it ends up being kind of translucent and blah. But we're using that to our advantage here. So when I'm going over the black, white, and gray, we immediately get a very dramatic lighting effect here. So the green just has a lot more vibrance to it. And as you'll notice, it's blending a tiny bit. I'm being careful not to do this deliberately, but it's coming together with just a single layer of glazing. Let's see, what else did I want to say about? Oh, yes. And so one strategy is to come in and do your overpainting on your highlights first and then your lowlights. And you might need to wipe your brush off in between so that you're not muddying everything up. It depends on how much of the undercolor you're pulling up as you're applying your top layer. And so I've moved on to the overpainting on the yellow. And as you can see, there's already quite a bit of difference between this example and some of the others. So this is a spring green palette. Like, that yellow really causes the green to warm up and look really, really vibrant. So one thing I will say is the difference between your midtone and the dark tone here, the yellow and the brown, isn't as great. And so after the overpainting, it's a lot more subtle of an effect than the black, white, and gray. And so if I were to make this into a final piece, I might come back and do a little bit of highlighting over it, or, outlining to bring out the effect a bit more. Or, learn from this experience and add some white to my underpainting to get a brighter highlight. And then once again, the blue is very dramatic. So this is definitely sort of like a winter feel. That blue really cools it down. Yeah, all 4 of these are using the exact same green. There's no difference in that green overtone. Like this, the magic is happening from what's painted underneath. I will actually paint examples of what it looks like for the flesh. So I'll put that to the side. You can see what it looks like. But for the green, you know, it's when you put it down, it's going to seem watery. So that first leaf that I painted where you could see all the lines through it and everything was the same consistency as the other over paintings. So yeah, it looks a little translucent when I'm just put it down by itself. This is the consistency I'm using for the flesh. My first layer of overpainting for the flesh, the biggest thing that I'm doing is that I'm trying to make sure that I'm just putting the paint on without moving it around. So I'm very carefully just sort of dropping it on top of the highlight areas and then coming back after it's had the smallest amount of time to dry and then doing the low light areas. And it's not until I come to like the second or the third layer of the glaze that I'm moving the brush in between those areas at all. And I start very small, and then, you know, if I want more blending, that occurs with additional layers. So you don't want to be in a rush to blend things together with this. And you got to realize that it's going to take a couple of coats to get your effect. But those couple of coats are really creating a lot of depth. And it's creating a very gentle graded shadows for your features. Very natural looking. As I'm painting, I'm making sure that I'm following the features. So as I'm following the features, that's what's going to give me the final shape for, you know, my nasal bridge, my nostrils, everything else. So it's not until this point that I'm really even starting to blend things together. And even so, it's very restrained. Just a little bit of blending. We want the colors to mostly just shine through and create our contrast. Basically, one of the things I've discovered is try not to overdo it. So I've moved on to the next face, and I'm gonna let that one kind of stand. Doing a very different flesh tone here. So this is a warm brown that I've used. Again, I'm laying down the highlights, and then I'll come back and do the lowlights so that I'm not moving the underpaint around. And here in a moment, I'll kind of show you what the paint consistency looks like by itself. I'll just do a little dot on the side. And you can see already I'm starting to have some problems with that black shadow kind of blending, even though I don't want it to. This is letting the pigments do their jobs, but doing it in such a way that it's scattering the light or reflecting the light back in ways that life is already doing. Basically, because you've got these tiny, tiny layers, you're actually creating different points of reflection, which creates the illusion of depth. And it'll be apparent when we do the third face that when you have a green background and then you add pink on top of it, you actually create contrast that the eye can catch even better. And so those colors just pop right off the page. So that's an amazing effect that's fun to play with. But the leaves, where you've got the black and the white, deciding whether or not the light's reflecting back to you, and then you just plop the green on top of it, that's how you're able to get such amazingly different effects from your black and white versus the yellow versus the blue. So a lot of fun things you can do with that. Hopefully you can see from my little samples on the side there just how thin this glaze is. And so you just having the patience to apply it a little bit at a time, letting it dry between your layers, and being sure that when you first start, you want to be building up your areas that are going towards your highlight more than you're building up the shadowed areas. So somebody mentioned that they're having some trouble controlling it. So when you pull the glaze up on your brush, you actually want to wipe a fair amount of it off on the side of your palette. And oftentimes I'll have a little paper towel where I dab it just a tiny bit so that I'm applying, it doesn't have a bead of liquid at the end of the brush. It's in the bristles. And so, and part of it is the fact that it's a very nice brush that will hold the paint without having it all pull out at once. So you might need to play around with different paintbrushes, but I would definitely play around with dabbing your brush on a paper towel before you begin, and see if that helps you. What color am I using now? Have I moved to pink? Maybe. I'll do a dab on the side in just a second. No, this is the same yellow as the first face. This is my Naples yellow. So it's a peachy yellow. I will do some pink mixed in later. This part of the video is sped up because I had to do this so many times. The rest of the video is not. But again, I'm making sure that I'm doing my glaze first on my highlight areas, then the low light areas, and just having the patience to go back and do it again and again and again. So I'm using the Winsor Newton gouaches, and I've just diluted it down with water. I have not added any gum arabic or anything to it. So as you can see, as it's drying, it's more of the back pigment area is coming through. So that is why I have to keep doing it so many times. But after my first couple of layers, I start following the contour of the face a little bit. And that's how I both pick out my features to have them have the final shape I want, as well as create some smoothness between the eye and the cheek. Because if you always just follow your low lights, you're going to end up looking like raccoon people. Okay, and so my last couple of layers on that third face were a slightly pinker layer, mostly targeting the forehead and the cheeks and the chin. And if I were doing a somebody with a paler complexion, I would be building it up even further, even paler, and then even pinker. So, but this individual is got some South American ancestry, and so this is actually appropriate for her. All right, so for my fourth face, this is the same Naples yellow as I used on face 1 and face 3. It's just with the strong brown and purple, the effect is so much different. And so again, I'm doing my highlights. I'm just slapping it on top of the purple to counterbalance that a little bit. Oh, I grabbed too much. You can see I dab my brush off and then I kind of work that out around. And this person I actually remembered to paint the neck on, so you can see how I'm blending out underneath the jaw to create a little bit of shadow without it looking like a beard. Nothing wrong with beards, just doesn't look right on my friend. Stretch. All right, so now that I've got a couple layers on there, I'm definitely following the contours of the face a little bit more to try to bring out the structure I want for the nose and the cheeks. As it's drying, the purple comes through really strongly. So again, I've put a little bit too much on for my lowlights, but part of that was also wanting to create a dramatic effect that you guys could really see as part of this example. That's starting to come together a little bit better. So one of the things I've been doing, I'm not sure if you caught, is as I got a little bit of purple on my brush, I was using that to create some depth in the temples and some of the areas that might have a little bit of a lighter shadow to them, without dragging shadow all over the place. So if I do notice my brush is getting dark, I'm either cleaning it up or I'm using it strategically. So basically, I'm using kind of the same amount of glaze, the same thickness of the glaze, and I'm just speckling it on. So this is a dabbing technique. I'm doing a tiny bit of like blending it so it doesn't just look like spots, but I'm just going over it with black, and some of that gray is still going to come through. And then I'll come through and I'll speckle it with a gray. How do you decide what colors of underpainting to use? Some of this has been trial or error. Sometimes it's I go to one thing that helped me was going to Photoshop and kind of using the dropper function and clicking on the dark shadowy parts. And if you can figure out what color the dark shadowy parts are, that's what you want your underpainting to be, at least your darkest parts. And so there's a little bit of color theory subtraction going on here. If I'm going to be overpainting with a yellowy peach and I want like a dark cold brown, I'm going to start with like a purple. If I want the colors to remain pretty true, I might do the black and white. So some of it's going to be trial or error, figuring out what works for you. Some of it's going to be looking at examples that you want to use. But really, it's do you want warmth showing through? Underpaint with a warmth. If you want your colors to be true, do a monochromatic. If you're looking for a specific ethnicity, you're really going to need to look at the pigments that create that look, and that's going to be what you lay down. And that's why I try to show you so many different examples of, if this is what you're after, this might be what you start from. But it's hard to go wrong with brown. Like, when in doubt, start with a brown you like, and then do black and white over it, and that will give you a lot of depth without being sort of shocking. And then you can play with more colors from there. So for the most part, your overpainting is going to brighten you up. So you think about your underpaintings being darker. Does anybody want to share what they were able to do in the period of time where I was zooming through?
It's an interesting concept. I'm doing an online watercolor class mundanely with a girl in England, and she layers it completely differently, but it's not with gouache. She's not using gouache.
Right.
And
So
the little bit of calligraphy and illumination I've used gouache, but I want to learn how to layer. So so this was helpful.
Oh, good. So gouache and watercolor act a little bit differently. So watercolor, no matter what you do, is going to sort of blend as you go. And so you take advantage of that with that medium. Whereas here, it's got a little bit of an acrylic identity. And so you can use that to create layers that are different. And it also does some really amazing things if you work with it while it's thick for blending. So you can do blending with gouache that you couldn't even dream of with watercolor, because you can actually like overpaint it with a heavy layer and then come back with an almost dry brush and blend it to the degree you want. And that's a very different approach, because it has that combination between acrylic and watercolor that lets you kind of do both of the techniques. So yeah,
it's fun to play with it. And
I'm glad you're enjoying. Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm going to try another scroll now pretty soon.